most of you, if not all of you, know that on July 1st, 1847, the U.S. Post Office introduced the 5 and 10 cent first 5 and 10 cent stamps in the U.S. 7 years after the U.K., 5 years, I think, after Brazil. And we all think, why did they wait so long? In fact, even before that, there were cover letters coming out of Boston, carried by the post office with stamps on them. And there are about 20 or so letters known with the New York Postmaster Provisional. Let me see if I can increase the size of this so you can see it better. Whoops, there's a delay in there. Okay. This letter was sent in, let me get rid of this, on November 8th, 1845, from Boston to New York, bearing a New York Postmaster Provisional. The provisional was created by the New York Postmaster, had them printed by the same guys who eventually printed the 5 and 10 cent 1847. And since he knew that some of these stamps might end up in other post offices, turns out about maybe 24 ended up in the Boston post office, he had sent a letter. And he said, look, if you happen to see a letter bearing one of these stamps deposited in your post office, consider it as an unpaid letter and mark it as such. And when I get it, since it's already been paid for in my post office, I'll make the books balance. Well, if you look at this 5 here is a manuscript 5 applied in Boston. It's the manuscript color and the handwriting are very specific. Here's your Boston CDS, which nicely but almost accidentally cancels the stamp. And when it got to New York, the New York Postmaster put an X through the stamp and marked it paid. Done and done. So about 2 years later, they started producing the 5 and 10 cent 47s and sent a bunch of them to Boston. Eventually, Boston got a little over 400,000 5s and a little over 40,000 10s. Only New York and Philadelphia got more. And what I'd like to do is I'll go through in a fairly logical progression by distance, by weight, and then domestic and foreign, and show you what I hope you'll enjoy as some very unusual and interesting covers. Let me go back. Okay. These are 2 5 cent 47s paying for a letter of up to half an ounce going up to 300 miles. And whoops, I'll get this right. And the top one, this is a typical Boston Integral 5 CDS, which was the CDS du jour for these stamps, canceled with a 7-bar circular grid sent in February of 1850. If you look at the one on the bottom, it looks very similar, except the CDS is the Boston and Albany Railroad. This letter was not taken to the Boston Post Office, but put directly on the railroad, and went from Boston to Ware, Mass., which was on the way to Albany. Actually, quite a lot further to Albany, but here are 2 different CDSs on this particular half ounce up to 300 mile letter. Now I want to show you how they paid for a double weight letter. Of course, you could pay for it with a simple 5 cent pair. You could think you were paying for it with a single until it got to the post office and they said, no, it's overweight, so we need 5 cents due. And so that's what the Boston markings of this type were always in red, not always, but often in red crayon. There are a few of them with the 5 cent due, not a lot. And here is the same distance and same weight letter paid for with a 10 cent 47. Very simple, very straightforward. Now, let me just double check to make sure I didn't skip one. No, I guess I didn't. A letter of up to 300 miles, but weighing 1 to 1.5 ounce or 1 to 2 ounce. One of each is shown on this page. But what this page shows is a very unusual situation that occurred in early 1849. You remember, if you remember, we had an agreement with the UK in late 1848, early 1849, which provided for transatlantic letters sent across the ocean, and how much they would cost, and how much of that cost would go to the U.S., the UK, and to the country who contracted with the transatlantic steamer. It was interesting that if you look at that, Britain never had a triple rate. They went from 1/2 to 0 to 1/2, 1/2 to 1 ounce, and then 1 ounce to 2 ounces. So if you got into 1 to 2 ounce, you had to pay quadruple rate. There was no triple rate. So for whatever reason, we decided that we were going to abolish the triple rate, which makes the and since it happened in early March of 49, and these stamps were only issued less than 2 years earlier, finding triple rate covers for Boston from anywhere are not common. There's only 2 reported strips of 3 5-cent 1847s used at Boston. And notice this one has a red crayon marking 15, which is what the letter was supposed to cost. If you go down here, a couple of unusual things. One is this is a combination of the 5-cent 47 and the 10-cent 47. Again, not very common. In Boston, there are only 2 known, and the other one is only a front. So this is not bad. But this was originally marked 15. It was marked 15 in the same way the one on the top was marked. But if you look very carefully, it says unpaid 5. This letter was posted after March 15th, 1849, after the triple rate was eliminated. So they underpaid the letter and it was due another nickel, basically. Okay. This is one of the covers I think is the coolest. This is a 1 to 2 ounce letter, just like the one on the bottom of the last page was, up to 500 miles. And it has 2 vertical pairs of the 5-cent 47, sort of say tenant, with a nice 20-cent marking, Boston marking, and the Boston CDS sent to New York. There's only 2 examples of 4 5-cent adhesives paying the quadruple rate under 300-mile rate. And the neat part of these is originally it was a block of 4. I was able to sort of reconstruct it by using Photoshop, and put them together the way they were originally. I'm sort of glad that they cut them and put them on the envelope this way, because if they had put the block of 4 on it, it would still be in somebody else's hands because I couldn't afford it. That's a very expensive item. So now, if you look at, I can never remember where I am. So let me. The numbers are too light. This is over 300 miles, up to 1/2 ounce. So now we're going over 300 miles. So this top one is a single letter, or up to 1/2 ounce letter, paid by with a single 5-cent stamp. 10-cent stamp rather. Not uncommon. It's a very pretty cover. It's a beautifully centered stamp, but it's no big deal. Now, if any chemists in the area, they would know galena is lead. Galena is lead ore, and Galena, Illinois, was known for its lead mines that lasted well into the later 18th century. A friend of mine lives there. But one of my first covers that I was able to pick up, searching for 47s to add to my original Boston exhibit, which I was real light on. So I asked a friend of mine, Gordon Eubanks. By the way, Gordon has the most magnificent multi-frame exhibit of the 1847s, I think, right now in existence. You can see it on the Classic Society website. You don't even need to be a member. And I recommend anybody that loves the 47s, you can go through that exhibit. Gordon won the Champion of Champions in 2012, but since then he's been adding material every year, and he has most of what Bill Gross had, all the wonderful material. So it's an incredible exhibit. And the bottom one, just like a couple of pages ago, you can pay 10 cents in two different ways, 2 5s or 110. Here we pay it in 2 5s. And here you can see that really bright 7-bar grid. And what you should know about that 7-bar grid is to the larger post offices, the U.S. Post Office sent out these hand stamps because this is how they wanted them to be canceled, either that or with a manuscript X. So you see these grids in different colors in different cities. Philadelphia, for example, used a blue one, the typical Philadelphia blue. Okay, so here we are, and we're still over 300 miles, up to half ounce. And here is unusual. It's a vertical pair. There's two unusual things. This is a vertical pair, and you see many fewer vertical pairs than horizontal pairs. Why? Because when the post office got the sheets, they cut them in horizontal strips. They would fit in the teller's drawers better. So that's why you see, 5, 10 times as many horizontal pairs as verticals. Now, this one has a U.S. Express Mail, here it says Boston, Mass marking. Now, this really wasn't Express Mail. It was a letter that bypassed the post office and was put directly on the train. But since all letters got to the train, it didn't get there any sooner. The reason they used the term Express Mail had to do with the independent mail companies that were getting letters and quicker to their destinations, and this is part of the competition. It was really that CDS is really a marketing gimmick, to be honest. Now here's one over 300 miles between 1/2 and 1 ounce, a strip of 4 5-cents, only one of two known, with a strip of 4 5-cent adhesives. Again, with the Express Mail marking. This sent probably in the middle of 1849. Now we got double weight letters going over 300 miles. Typically we've got a horizontal pair of 5s, and the only reported example of a vertical pair of the 10-cent use from Boston. This is a 20-cent mark hand stamp. There's a little smudge here. Originally, this was a little 3. And in the previous rate period, they denote 20 3/4 cents. But they burnished a bit out the 3 so they could use it during the 45 to 51 period. It took me a while to get this cover because I bid on it once and lost it. And then somehow Harvey Bennett, who was running the auction house, came up with it again. And I was able to get it for the exhibit. Now, in the later 40s, Boston established a semi-official penny post, a carrier service. They had more informal carrier service for a long time, but they established it more specifically in 49, when the postmaster at Boston named a James Patterson and his carriers that did parcel post to provide letter delivery. There were 2 stamps issued. The first one, and I'll show you a close-up of that. The first one here says penny post. Simple enough. This is on a cover with a 5-cent 47. Wouldn't have been in my exhibit if it didn't have the 5-cent 47. Goes to Paris. Paid 30 décimes, 20 cents to 20 of them to the UK, 10 to France. And the penny got it to the post office in Boston. The 5-cent got it to carry it across the Atlantic. This is the only penny post cover known to go transatlantic. This is from Steve Walsky's collection, if you know Steve. The bottom one, now we're still in the, single weight up to 300 mile category. The bottom one has the second penny post stamp. It says penny post paid. And it's in a little, looks like it's a little lighter color. There are only 4 recorded covers with both the 5-cent 47 and the second carrier stamp, the penny post. I had one at one time that I lost. God knows where it is. Hopefully it's still in my house somewhere and I'll find it. Now there are also covers with the penny post stamp going over 300 miles. This top one is going to DC. And like the other one, I showed earlier, they put a 5-cent stamp when they needed 10. The post office recognized they needed 10 because they put a 10-cent integral rate CDS on it. They said it was due 5, sent it to Washington, where it was remarked paid 10. Very unusual cover. And the bottom one is maybe even more unusual. It is 2 5-cent stamps with the penny post. It's the only recorded cover with a Boston carrier stamp with a full 10-cent rate paid on it. So these four penny post stamps are really prizes that I'm very proud of having. Now, of course, there are letters with the 1847 out of Boston going overseas. Several to Canada. This one was paid at this time. You couldn't pay it all the way through. The U.S. paid their part of it, and when it got to Canada, they paid their part. This went across the border at Derby Line, Vermont, I lost the term. An official transit station, not the right words, but it describes it well. And then it went on to Sherbrooke in Canada, East Canada, and that was under 60 miles from the border. And so the guy who received it, Mr. Ball, paid 4.5 pence Canadian for the rest of the trip, or as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. This is also a very cool cover. This paid 10 cents to its border crossing, and it went to a place north of Burlington, Vermont, which is just over 300 miles. And when it got to Canada, it went to Hamilton, Canada West, and they paid again 4.5 cents Canadian. The unique part of this cover is on the back. There is this hand stamp, forwarded by Favors Package Express. Favor carried mail from Boston to Eastport, Maine by ship on the steamer Admiral. And he had an agreement with the post office, but there are only 5 or so covers with that rectangular marking. There are a lot more with what they call a triple circle, but only 5 or so with the rectangular. And this is the only one used on an 1847 cover. I had a cover that looked almost exactly like this without the Favors marking. And I didn't even know this one existed. And a guy from Rumsey, Matt Kuriga, called me and said, "Hey, we got a cover coming up in our auction you might be interested in." Yeah, you think, Matt? You think? He was right. Here's a few more covers to Canada and one to Mexico, which is really cool. This one was actually sent from one part of British North America to another. It starts out in Halifax, comes down to Boston, and is forwarded to St. Catharines, Canada West. So it's a double cross-border cover. When it got to Boston, it was the forwarder put this 5-cent vertical pair on to send it back up to Canada. And again, when it got there, they paid 4.5 pence Canadian. I thought this was the only double cross-border cover and had it listed this way in my exhibit for a few months until somebody put another one up in auction. That's why you have to watch the auctions really carefully. Either that or hope the judges don't. This is something similar. This is just it's a 10-cent cover rather than 2 5s paid with a 10. But when it got to Canada across the border, the distance between the border crossing and Amherstburg, Canada West, was much further. It was 200 to 300 miles, and the cover was charged 11.5 pence Canadian. Now, this bottom one is a real prize. It was sold in one of the last gross sales in New York. I was sitting in there with a few friends across from a guy. It's a good friend of mine from the Philatelic Foundation Board. And I saw this come up, and it's the only recorded 1847 cover one of 3 recorded to Mexico, the only one from Boston. 10-cent provided the payment to New Orleans. Then it was paid. It was paid to go by Prey to Veracruz. Unbeknownst to me and my friend across the aisle didn't know I was interested, didn't realize I was bidding, and he was bidding. Luckily, before it went too high, I went, Dan, and he saw me, and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't want to bid against you." A little late, but better late than never. So I was able to get this one. Now, we also have coverage going transatlantic bearing 5-cent 47s. This one at the top is going to London. It went to London before the treaty. Before the treaty, the way things went was you had to get the cover to the port of departure. From the port of departure, it went on a Cunard steamer, in this case, the Hibernia. And for that trip from a U.S. port of departure to someplace in the U.K. was a shilling. So this is a shilling mark in manuscript, and that paid the rest of the rate, including the transatlantic fee, because these were British ships, and the internal British fee. And there are only three treaty letters known sent from Boston to the UK within 1847. This page has 2 of them. This is a little even more interesting. This, again, is another express mail marking, but this was carried privately from Montreal to Boston by hand or in a larger envelope or whatever. So it has no markings from Montreal. When it gets to Boston, it gets put on 5 cents, gets it to the boat. The boat gets it to the UK and then to Liverpool. And this is a shilling mark, a hand stamp. Much easier to, I think, note than the manuscript marks, which is scrawled in many different ways. Now, post-treaty, once the treaty was signed, we had an agreement with the UK that for a letter that went to the UK, it would be 24 cents. 3 cents would go to the UK, 5 cents would go to the US, and the middle 16 would go to whoever hired the ship. In most of these cases, it was Great Britain. Now, this is a weird letter. I looked at it, and I didn't quite get it, because the requirement was you had to either send the letter fully paid or fully unpaid. If it was part paid, they'd ignore the part payment. Yet they didn't. And so what we determined is that somebody must have taken it to the post office with a 5-cent stamp on it, was told that's not enough. I can't send it along unless you pay me the rest of the other 19 cents. So the sender paid that, and it was marked paid. The 19 was marked in red, which was basically what we owed the UK, or what was owed to the UK out of what the receiver would pay for it. And then it got to Liverpool and was marked with this, what we call a tombstone marking, which are, these are cool markings. Most of them aren't quite so interesting. Now, the bottom letter was one of two letters from Boston to Germany bearing a 47. Again, the 5 cent paid for the rate to the port for a half ounce letter. The addressee, when it got to Germany, paid 7 1/3 Silbergroschen. The German rates, since they're not only the rates, but the currency differed from German state to German state. So these get very complicated. I had to send it to a guy named Dwayne Litauer to make sure I understood what the rate was. As I noticed, it's unclear how the transatlantic rate was charged or how it was credited to the UK, but this paid for everything from the time it left New York. In this case, it went from Boston to New York until it got to Germany. Now, there were 19 decimes, and I'm not sure where I got the 19, except that Dwayne told me. That was what was paid in France, 10 for the UK and 9 for the for either I got this right or I copied and pasted wrong, and this bottom has nothing to do with this cover. I'll have to check that. I think if there are a couple letters here sent to France post-treaty, these are a couple pretty letters. This one, again, 5 cents paid to the rate to the port. When it got to France, the addressee paid 15 decimes, 10 to the UK and 5 to France. This is all based on a UK-France agreement of 1843. The bottom one is another unusual one. Remember I said the letter on the previous page, part was paid in cash and part was paid in stamps. At that time, I thought that was the only cover known where part was paid in cash. Aha, Steve Walski educated me. This is an even more unusual cover because it was a 5 cent 47 was applied, but it was decided that it was going to go on an American ship. And since the country that hired the steamer, you had to pay all your part of the fee. So the country who hired the steamer had to pay that 16 cents. So whoever brought it to the post office found out that, no, it's going on an American ship, so the 5 cents is not enough. You'll have to pay me another 16 cents. So it was marked 16 paid, and it got to, then it went on the Cunard, the Collins steamer Arctic to Liverpool and London, and then on from London to La Rochelle, France. And again, 15 cents. This seems total 10, including 10 discriminatory seaposts. That was part of the treaty between the UK and France, even though those weird discriminatory or retaliatory rate, and that's a whole different presentation, between the UK and the US had been eliminated. The one to France had not been. So these are the two covers I know of where part of the mandatory payment was made in cash. Now, if you've exhibited or seen a lot of exhibits, one of the big things now is to end an exhibit with an epilogue. And I'll tell you, sometimes it's really tough to figure out how do I close the exhibit out? How do I produce an epilogue? Well, the nice thing with the 47s, there's a ready-made epilogue. In July 1st, June 30th, 1851, the post office demonetized the 5 and 10 cent 47, saying they're not useful you can't use them for postage anymore. You got a couple weeks to bring them into the post office and we'll cash them out for you, but you're not supposed to use them on covers. Well, most Americans were cheap and most postmasters were easy. I think there are about 72 letters known with demonetized 5 or 10 cent 47s on them, and 70 of them were accepted by the post office, which is good because if it weren't, I wouldn't have this epilogue. The top cover bears a 5 cent 47, and this cover was sent a year after demonetization. It is it's the latest demonetized 5-cent 47 cover. And I think it's only one of two with this large Boston paid, which wasn't used until January of 52. So 1 of 5, it's not bad. The bottom one is even cooler. This is the only 10-cent 47 demonetized out of Boston. It's the only 10-cent demonetized cover used to Canada. And it's really cool because it's a demonetized stamp paying a legal rate. The postage was correct to Canada, 10 cents, because now you could pay it through, even though the adhesive itself was illegal. But thank goodness both the Boston Postmaster and the Canadian Postmaster accepted. And that's it. That's my 47. You guys are, this was only shown about 2 or 3 times. And so it was truly my pleasure to be able to take you through it tonight. So if there are any questions, I'll leave the exhibit up just in case, people want to bring the covers back up. But if there are any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer.
I know we're going to get a digital round of applause from Mark. It was absolutely stellar and just, again, a fantastic exhibit and showing of just some stellar material, Mark. I mean, again,
Thank you.
I think you've blown the audience away. We know why you are a champion of champion here and showing this material, and the fact that you've collected these artifacts and you've preserved them here to share with us is, again, just amazing to me.
By the way, this was the first virtual single frame CFC. It won a grant at a real show. And the AAP decided, since we had all the people had won at real shows, they were going to hold the champion of champion virtually, and at the same time as Chicago PEX, I think, last year.
That's right.
So I'm glad they did.
We were glad they did, and we're glad you chose to share with us. And so again, thank you. Question from my end, I'll just kick things off too, because I think not everybody understands too, or knows, maybe is aware of when they use the ink, black versus red. You showed that with the 19, and that was sort of, right, what was due on the other side versus if they would have struck that in black ink, correct? So maybe the distinction there between the two hand stamps of credit due to the other nation, right?
Yeah, in the US, I don't think, especially for domestic mail, generally black versus red didn't start that early, but certainly part of the agreement, the accountancy agreement between the UK and the US, mandated red and black debit, red credit, and so you see them on these covers. Once in a while, a little later, I think you see them on domestic mail, either if it's unpaid or even part paid. You'll see it black instead of a red CDS.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you clarifying that for us. Any other questions? Let's open it up, please.
Yeah, I have one if I can formulate it correctly. It started out, I guess, before the treaty. It was not half and half, but we paid it to the ocean. And then once it got the other side of the other country, they paid it collect. Now,
the before the treaty, Cunard had a monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
Primarily, they sailed into Boston until later closer to the treaty, and then they started also sailing in New York. The rate that Cunard charged, or through Cunard, the British charged for a letter going on a Cunard steamer across the Atlantic, either way, was 1 shilling. It went to Britain. The other stuff you see is what it took to get it to or from the port in the U.S. The 5 cents, or in some cases, not for Boston, but 10 cents.
Gotcha.
Let me go back and see. This is pre-treaty. Yeah, you see, you have the shilling mark. There are no accountancy marks, no 19s, no fives or three. That's because before the treaty, there were no accountancy rules. You paid to get it to the boat, and then when the boat took it to the addressee paid for the boat trip. And that was now post-treaty. There were all sorts of rules for letters just going between the UK and the US. 24 cents covered the whole bit. 5 cents to the US, 3 cents to the UK, and 16 cents to the country who hired the ship. In most cases, it was still a British ship, so that 16 cents went to the UK, and that's why that 19 cents was there.
Now, when you say the 16 cents goes to the country which owned the ship,
Which hired the ship.
hire the ship.
The
How
ships
much
were
goes to the
contracted.
country, how much goes to the ship's captain?
Oh, that was irrelevant. It was a contract.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
The ship didn't work on peace, didn't do piecework.
Okay.
He was salaried.
I
So
can't
this is
imagine any
different. So sorry, Paul, the distinction should be made here, Mark, right? That a ship letter where the captain would get, for example, in the stampless era, right? They built that 2 cents to the ship captain if they were carrying mail. The first call of order when they landed at the port was to drop off any mail that was in their care to the post office when they landed in port. Then there would be that letter fee or that 2 cent fee that would go to the captain.
Only for US captains.
Correct. That's
US
correct.
ships. Okay.
Thank you.
And once the treaty was signed, we were able to take advantage of treaties that the UK had with other countries. That's how letters could get to Germany or to France. So once they got to the UK, then they were sent on based on the details of the treaty that the UK had with France first in I think 36, and then it was redone in 43, and then with agreements that had, I'm not sure if they were UK, France, Germany, or whatever, but agreements that were for forwarding mail further on. It gets pretty complicated. For those who are interested in this stuff, Understanding Transatlantic Mail is a book that Dick Winter wrote. Actually, he wrote two of them, 2 volumes. The first one is dog-eared. It's the one that I use most often. And he has some of the best explanations of all this stuff. He is a past master at this material. So if you really want to learn it, find that book. It may not be for sale anymore. Take it out of the library or whatever.
Or ask me, and I'm happy to share it with you because I've got the volumes here. So if anybody at the club wants it on loan, yeah, absolutely, Mark. It's a great resource. I'm glad you mentioned it.
We have the sailing tables on the Classic Society website, but we don't have those books.
Correct. We don't yet, Mark. Maybe at some point down the road we might be able to.
Yeah, we may.
We may. I have a question too out of the demonetized ones before we again open it up, because I know how many are there that were demonetized and used after, and that's part of your epilogue. Out of any of those, and remind me, because I'm a 3 cent 1851 nut, and these, that's what took over after these were demonetized on July 1st. Are there any of the covers that were demonetized that have a 5 or 10 cent on it that then were struck with, not good for postage, and a 3 cent was used on top of that? Do you know of any of those?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
And you can go on the Class Society website and look at post July 1st, 1851, and you should be able to find all the demand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's in the database, in the Mark Schur database you're talking about, right? I know we've got almost.
And I don't think you'll see a 3 cent 51 on there. As I said, I just had a weird note come across my screen. My internet is unstable, so let me know if you're having problems hearing me. Out of the 72 known, 70 were accepted. So there were only 2 that were unaccepted, and those do not have a 3 cent.
Okay. So then really, so then there really wouldn't be, right? If almost 98% of them were accepted, they all went through, and they took the rate. Understood. Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
And my novice question next is that the Universal Postal Union, that's what took care of a lot of these issues, made it more.
Yeah, but it took until 1875 for everybody to agree, or not everybody, for most people to agree.
Mm-hmm.
They gradually reduced the amount of accountancy markings that you had to put on, I think in the third British agreement, which is like 1869, you no longer had to have a lot of these accountancy markings, but the big part of the UPU was the same rate. It was the same rate for everybody in a different currency, but the same rate. So it was really a lot easier. There was no accountancy issues, and all the they put a lot of guys with green eye shades out of business at post offices around the world.
Mhm.
Mark, can you speak to, I'll just ask another question, because you showed cross-border to Canada, and we know that there's a fair amount that went up there, and you showed also when it got to Canada, at least they used the manuscript marking for the rate, just like here, 4.5 or 11.5 and all. There are a few mixed uses, and I don't know that I missed it, where you have a US 5 or 10 cent and you've got a Canadian, pence stamp as well. In these cases, it's here they paid and then they manuscripted, but in other cases they did use a Canadian stamp, so you have a mixed use, right? Between
Yeah, those are howlingly rare and extremely desirable. Again, if you look at the gross sales from Siegel,
Yes.
you'll see a few. They had the beaver.
Yes, that's right. They did. They had the 5 cent
and a
beaver.
47, or in some cases a beaver in like 647s. Those are wonderful material. I'm glad nothing from Boston was like that, because
Right.
I wouldn't be able to get that. I don't know too many people who would.
Yeah, no, I would
Great
agree.
material.
And they really are scarce and rare, because in the end, it really was the manuscript marking once it got into country up
Right.
north, more than putting a stamp on it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? You've got Mark on
Hey,
the
Mark.
line.
Question,
Hi, Lou.
uh, pre-treaty, was it possible, Mark, for someone to deliver a letter to that ship? In other words, if they were traveling to that area, say the port of departure, and instead of affixing the 5 or the 10 cent stamp, that they could hand deliver it, or was it like part of the deal that you had to stamp the cover with a 5 or a 10 center to get it to the port?
If you were close enough, if you were in Boston, or in some cases you're in New York, listen, if people can save money, they'll do it. So there are certainly ways of letters that were delivered to the port, to the ship. Of course, they're much less interesting looking because they don't have any U.S. stamps or markings on them, and all they will have is the markings of the U.K. And I'm not sure actually what the U.K. would charge in that case, whether they would charge the 19 cents and that's it, or not. There's certainly, during the retaliatory rate period, where we were still arguing and trying to come up with an agreement to sign, when you had to pay the full boat, no pun intended,
Right.
for the letter on both sides of the Atlantic. Yeah, there were lots of ways that people found of skipping the post office, and they'd save 29. They might save 29 cents or 24 cents or 34 cents. So they would do it.
Okay. Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Because I could ask another, but I want to see if we have other
Yeah.
folks here. Please. Mike.
I've got one on the La Rochelle cover, because it looks like there's a red 20 under the 24.
I know which one you're talking about.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Is that a 20 underneath that, or?
It probably
Underneath?
is. It probably is. It was just a mistake that was made by the post office. Let me increase the size of it. I'm sure it is. Yeah, you can see the red. That's a Boston 20, and they just made a mistake.
So that makes that an even more rarer cover.
Well, it's
Yeah.
unique. It's unique to start with, so I'm not sure.
Unique
more
in that
unique.
respect.
Yeah,
Yeah. So that's just a mistake. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Couldn't add 5 and 16, I guess.
No, I don't think so.
Hey, Mark, another follow-up too, because I mean, I know this is all Boston in specific. We know that the 5 and 10 cent stamps that you were talking earlier, folks would find a way. There are definitely 5 and 10 cent stamps that have been reused on cover. They've had manuscripts removed and they were put on. And
Not on any of these covers.
yeah, not on the, not on any of these, just looking at our census on the classic site, there's probably a few that pop up where you'll see that clearly, if you look closely, that 5 or 10 cent that was used on cover definitely had another marking from being used before, and somebody tried to reuse it on another letter.
I'm sure. Hopefully it was
Yeah.
caught by somebody like the Philatelic Foundation
Yeah,
and
yeah.
given a bad cert.
And given a bad cert, that's exactly right. So nothing here though in this, I know that for sure. So nothing in Boston. So yeah, thank you, Mark. Thank
If there is, we don't tell anyone.
Nah, we don't say anything. Is that well? And some of those other Fox ones, the other scrap, as it were, now we've given to the PF Foundation, so they have
Right.
that entire archive
Right.
as we've pulled those off the market. So, yep, thanks.
I have a mundane question I've always wanted to know, and now it reminded me I'm going to ask it. A lot of the marks on the covers were struck in with metal, right? The cancel date stamps and
Oh,
other
yeah,
than
they were almost certainly brass hand stamps.
Okay. Now, obviously, I don't think, did they have felt stamps back then, or
They have what stamps?
would they have like felt, like we use a rubber stamp, would they have like, were they in felt, or did they like a platen on a press? They put ink on it.
Not that I know of. The hand stamps, all the hand stamps I'm seeing are brass. Now, you do have cases, not Boston, but cases of smaller towns that that had their own hand stamps made. Sometimes they were rubber hand stamps.
Okay.
Cork doesn't last long enough to do anything except cancel a stamp. Sometimes they were base metal that was melted and molded into a shape. But felt or
I meant felt as a pad. How did they get the ink onto the?
oh, I
Yeah,
assume they used an ink pad similar
Okay.
to what we have now.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.